97.3 ESPN.com Eagles insider John McMullen also covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. As the Eagles, the win isn't as important as what happened with the guys during the game. We'll get to with John now. John, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Josh.
So, John, obviously the wins and losses aren't as important as what the guys actually did on the field last night. So, and I asked this to Scott Grayson a little bit earlier, so I'm going to repeat the same question to you. When you walked away from the game last night, did you feel like there was a lot of positives out of last night, or do you think it was just a little more positive and negative? Because to me, there were definitely some things that stood out from last night that I was a little iffy and not too thrilled about.
Well, I think there were a lot of positives on the defensive side of the ball, a lot of issues on the offensive side of the ball. So I think it depends how you frame it. I think at least on paper, I think the Darby trade sort of solidifies the one issue on defense, and I think that group has a chance to be very, very good this season, as in top 10 in the NFL. And I think the offense as a whole is still obviously a work in progress.
Couldn't we argue, John, that part of Darby's performance last night might have been because of his familiarity with the Bills, and maybe we should just kind of let the jury maybe reconvene after the next game? Because, you know, when you practice with a team, you know some of their tendencies. So couldn't we argue some of his performance last night was a reflection of just his firsthand knowledge of the Bills?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. If you go back to last season and you think about how good the Eagles looked against Sam Bradford, I think a lot of that was the same. They knew Sam so well. They understood what he wanted to do, and I think Ronald certainly understood what the Bills were trying to do, some of the routes. And then you add into the fact that it's a guy with spectacular speed covering Anquan Bolden for the most part, and he had him in his hip pocket, and that's not a guy who's going to threaten him. So all of that is certainly fair to point out, but it doesn't change the fact that he's much better than anybody else they have at this particular position. He's the best cornerback they probably had in years from a talent standpoint. And you also have to look at the rest of the defense as a whole, which is, I've stated from the start, it's pretty darn good. When you look at the front four, you look at the linebackers, you look at the safeties, that's a good group. Specifically up front, when you talk about Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, Tim Jernigan, and whether it's going to be Vinny Curry or Derek Barnett, that's good. That is really, really good. So when you start from that standpoint, I think that's where the positives come from. And I think Darby being here just, again, solidifies the one weakness on that side of the ball. I'm not saying it makes it great, but it makes it acceptable. And then when you have the other parts, it could turn out to be pretty good.
Sticking with the defensive side of the ball, John, one of the things that I saw last night from the defense was that you saw Jim Schwartz, what this defense can look like when they're aggressive from the first snap on. Sometimes last year they were kind of put back on their heels, the cornerbacks. You saw McKelvin and Nolan Carroll's names half the game because their backs were turned. Whereas this year you saw what happens when you have a corner like Darby out there who can go, step for step with a wide receiver. You saw what happens when guys like Barnett and Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham are basically pushing the pocket back into the quarterback. You even saw guys like Steven Means, second and third team guys getting pressure on the quarterback. Talk about the value of having guys who fit Jim Schwartz's scheme out there on the field for the Eagles.
Well, it's very important. And it starts, I'm not going to say one thing one week and say another the next. So when you look at Rodney McLeod blitzing, in creating a turnover early, Understand we kind of made fun of Dom Capers and the Eagles did all week with all the blitzing he did in week 1 of the preseason, game plan. So I'm not concerned about aggression and stuff like that. If you understand what Jim wants to do, he wants to get to the quarterback with a 4-man rush. Now, he will feel a little bit more comfortable going to the blitz if he has to, if you have better players at the corner position, obviously, and they do with Darby. So that helps. That helps from that standpoint. But it's still going to be what it is. And he, as I said, he wants to get to the quarterback with a 4-man rush. And on paper, they can do that, which is a very, very positive sign, because if you look around this league and you look at the Eagles' front 4, it's top 5 in this league on paper. And I don't see that changing, because the 2 guys at centers around are obviously Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham. And they're going to bring it every week, and they're going to be very, very difficult to block for any opposing offense.
Talk with John McMullen on 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles Insider. Check out his 2 latest articles on the website. 1st and 10, Eagles outlast the Bills late in overtime. On late interception. Yeah, it's easy for me to read today. And John's also article, Eagles Stock Watch. He talks about Darby, Clement, and more. And I'm glad you talked about Clement, because, yeah, he scored a touchdown. Yeah, he had some really good runs. But the thing that stood out to me, John, with Corey Clement, the play action with the 3 tight ends, he didn't just block the man coming for the quarterback. He blocked him hard. That was a very good block off of a play action. And to me, that was the key to that Selleck pass, because let's be realistic. You can keep showing that pass over and over again, Selleck catching the ball. That's nice. But that pass never happens if Corey Clement doesn't lay out that block the way he did.
Yeah, that's a positive sign, because when you talk about young running backs in this league, that's generally the biggest issue they have is pass protection, especially blitz pickups. So if he's going to make this roster, he's going to have to be able to do that. And as I also mentioned, catching the football out of the backfield, you also have to put that in the equation, which he, to be honest, has not been very good at to this point, either in games or in practice. So I think he's still got a long way to go. But he showed some of those young legs, and the fact that this team has not been able to run the football basically at all through 2 preseason games, except when he's in there. So you have to at least raise your eyebrows over that, while also realizing Wendell Smallwood hasn't been out there yet. Darren Sproles really hasn't been out there. So, he's a bubble player, but he's making it more difficult for the Eagles, and that's what you have to do as a young player, make those decisions difficult.
You mentioned your article on the website about Wendell Smallwood, and we had Scott Grayson on, and he talked about how Smallwood needs to get on the field as well. And you mentioned, you used the line, Wendell Smallwood better get out of the tub. Wendell Smallwood is a guy who people had a lot of high hopes for because of his versatility. And the injuries are starting to make you wonder when this guy going to be on the field. Which do you think is more likely, that Clement steals Smallwood's spot on the roster, or that they both make the team possibly when the cuts happen?
I don't think they're both going to make the team, absent an injury of some nature to one of the third down backs, and that would be Sproles and Donnell Pumphrey. So I think they're both fighting for the same spot. And I still think Wendell has a significant leg up. The Eagles like the way he runs the football, but you have to be concerned. That's the quote you'll hear from coaches throughout the league. The best ability is availability. It doesn't matter how good you are. If you're not on the field, you can't help anybody. So I think that's the one point. I think this week is very, very key for Wendell Smallwood. I think he'll be back on the practice field. I think he'll play against Miami. And if he doesn't, well, he's got issues, because then people are going to start to raise their eyebrows, as I mentioned, and say maybe this isn't worth it if he's not going to be able to be there, and that's when sort of Clement would be in the conversation. I still think, though, at this point, he's more likely for the practice squad than the actual 53-man roster.
John, we have to talk about Lane Johnson because, last night, aside from that he got brutalized by the spin move by Jerry Hughes on the way to the quarterback, it just looked like, John, that you would think a guy of his athleticism could make the flip. It shouldn't be that out of place, but his footwork looked a little sloppy. He looked like he was overthinking when he was out there. Lane Johnson didn't exactly sell anybody on the idea of him moving from right tackle to left tackle anytime soon.
No, he didn't, and the good news is he's not. So that's the positive part. You have to understand what went on to get him to start at left tackle. Not only Jason Peters having a personal issue, but also Vaitai being out with a knee injury. Otherwise, he would have started at left tackle. So, the Eagles in the offseason, when Jason was away from voluntary work with contract issues, the Eagles used Lane on the left side, and the mentality is get them reps over there while they can. And I think that was the theory again here. And he is athletic enough to do it, and I think he'll be fine ultimately when he does move over. But it takes time. You can't just throw somebody in 1 week and say, go at left tackle against Jerry Hughes. People don't realize how good he is as an edge rusher. And you saw the sort of embarrassment. If Lane was there practicing every week and getting the footwork down, getting the fundamentals down, you'd see it get better each and every week. But to throw him out there cold against somebody like Hughes, you're going to be embarrassed every once in a while.
John, we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on what the big national story is coming out of the Eagles game, which was before the game. And I appreciated your tweet out there because you said, and I'm quoting from your tweet, Chris Long respects the national anthem and his teammates. The two have never been mutually exclusive class act who many could learn from. And I was saying earlier, John, that whether people agree or disagree with what Chris Long and Malcolm Jenkins did last night, they sounded like adults. They sound like professionals after the game discussing their reasoning why. And to me, I think that's a good signal to the rest of the league that you can do this type of stuff without doing it in a way that comes off as childish or immature or unaware. And whereas Chris Long and Malcolm Jenkins came off as very aware of what they were doing and they were very purposeful in their reasoning for it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I don't think it was they got together. They didn't talk about it. I think it did just kind of happen. And it was more, I think, from Chris's standpoint than Malcolm's, in the fact that he just wanted to do something to support his teammate. And the point I tried, it's difficult to get something across, obviously, in 140 characters. But I don't understand why people can't, everything isn't simple, and it's not one side or the other. In fact, if you think about any problem in life, there's shades of gray, and that's the issue here. And I think it was a perfect example because Chris has tremendous respect for the national anthem. He said that. He said it again and again and again. But he also likes Malcolm Jenkins. He also respects his teammate. He also wants to support them. You don't have to agree with everybody on every aspect of life. In fact, I don't know anybody who does, whether you're married, whether it's your wife, whether it's your husband. People fight. People have disagreements. It doesn't mean you're coming from a point of ill will, and yet you get into these political arguments and people take these stands, and as I mentioned, they're not mutually exclusive. Both sides are wrong. If you think your side is right and there's no discussion worthy from the other side, I got news for you. You're wrong. And it doesn't matter which side you're on, because people come at issues from different perspectives, and they can believe different things. And to me, it's just head shaking that people can't understand that.
So with John McMullen, you can follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. He covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. John, let's hit on a couple NFL topics here. So Blake Bortles, he had 5 incompletions last night on the stat sheet, but was overlooked that those 5 incompletions were pretty ugly. The regression of Blake Bortles seems to have hit a breaking point finally for Doug Marrone, where he's talking about the possibility that he's going to have a quarterback competition. If that's the case, Chad Henne could steal the job from Blake Bortles, because Blake Bortles, from whatever his mindset and his ability and his skill set was in December of 2015 to what it is now, he seems like he is going the wrong direction fast. And the irony, John, is that this could be the 3rd Jaguars quarterback this franchise has drafted who has been drafted in the top 15 who has not turned out at all the way they had hoped.
Yeah, and, it was pretty clear. I'd gotten a number of sources around draft time that said Tom Coughlin was not very high on Blake Bortles, and he was considering taking a quarterback at number 4 overall. And it's sort of what I was just talking about from a political sense to a football sense. People assumed once they took Leonard Fournette that he didn't have an issue with Blake Bortles. No, he had an issue with Blake Bortles. He just didn't think the options available, whether it was Trubisky or Mahomes or Watson, were worthy of being selected there. That was not a stamp of approval on Blake Bortles by any stretch of the imagination. And you see it playing out now. The fact that this organization, and this is the underreported aspect of this, if Blake Bortles happens to be the starting quarterback this season and, say, gets injured in week 3, well, his contract for next year is guaranteed for injury, so all of a sudden you're on the hook for $19 million. So you have to throw that into the equation as well. And at some point, it looks like they're getting to the breaking point and say, you know what, this guy isn't the answer, so let's play Henne. Let's not roll the dice on his health and be caught with him for another season. It's not going to work out well because Chad Henne's not a good NFL quarterback. But Jacksonville's been losing for a long time, and I think it's going to continue this year.
John, other NFL news. So it seems like we have conflicting information with Le'Veon Bell. Bell's agent denies there's any agreement on terms with the Steelers. There's reports the Steelers offered him a 5-year deal worth over $60 million. There's other reports out there that Bell may not come back in time for the start of the season. You know, John, they need to figure out if Le'Veon Bell wants to be a part of this football team or not, because I don't think Bell understands, John, that you can say you want all the money you want, but if you're not out there available to play the game, no one's going to pay you anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's supply and demand, unfortunately, for him at that particular position. You're right. I mean, there's a limit to the fact, and I understand he's upset by that, but that's just the reality of it. And he will come in. I mean, those stories are ridiculous. He's not going to walk away. He's not going to sit out. He's not going to retire, certainly. So he either plays for the Pittsburgh Steelers under the franchise tender or he doesn't get paid. So that's not a concern. The concern from Pittsburgh's standpoint is you're probably going to have a guy coming in the week before the regular season or maybe 2 weeks, whenever he decides it's time to get going, and perhaps he's not going to be ready. But he's so good, I wouldn't even be concerned about that standpoint. Long term, he's trying to make this argument that he's part running back, part receiver to sort of raise that salary up from that kind of standpoint. But the Steelers have all the leverage. They could franchise him again. Obviously, it would be a raise again, similar to what you see what's going on in Kirk Cousins. But because of the average of that position, it's never going to get to the number that Le'Veon wants. And at some point, he's just going to have to accept that.
John, one more final NFL topic here. Staying in the AFC North, the Ravens bring Jeremy Zuta back to the fold with a 2-year, $4 million deal. This is a situation where the Ravens, they've just had so many injury issues, not just this year, but the last couple of years. It seems like they just can't avoid it. And on top of all this, you have a quarterback who has a back problem. We don't really still understand what he did to his back. That seems all this big suspicious mystery. All we know is that he did it while at the gym. Meanwhile, Ryan Mallett is continuing to prove why most people passed on him over the years, because they don't really see him being what anybody ever anticipated he'd be. Was recruited out of high school. It really seems like the Ravens are kind of at a crossroads here, John, because they were 8-8 last year, and now they're in a situation where if they don't get healthy, I don't see any way they're going to be any better than 7-9.
No, I agree. It's not looking like a good season for the Ravens, which would be the third straight one out of the playoffs, and obviously that's an organization used to being in the postseason. And some have even speculated, John Harbaugh would be the dream coach of Jeffrey Lurie, and what happens if he has a bad season? Would the Eagles consider moving on from Doug Peterson if things were just average, or 8-8 or something of that nature if Harbaugh became available? I think that's something to keep an eye on, because the injuries there have been significant already, and it's not going to be good, most likely, for the Ravens. If Joe Flacco's not able to play, and you mentioned, we know from Tony Romo how tricky back injuries can be. They continue to say that he's going to be ready for the regular season, but originally he himself said it was going to be 1 week of training camp. We're far past that. He's still not ready. And they're going to be really bad if Joe Flacco's not out there. So, I mean, it's one of those things. Football is a very, very difficult sport. You see it in Indianapolis as well with the injuries. It can ruin a season, and it can ruin a season quickly, and that seems to be what's going on in Baltimore.
He is John McMullen. He's our 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles insider, also NFL columnist for FanRag Sports. You can follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. John, appreciate the time. It's Friday. Hope you get to relax a little bit this weekend.
Now practice starts up. You know that, Josh.
I said a little bit. I didn't say a lot. All right, John, take care.
Enjoy your weekend, buddy.